Hello, everyone. Welcome to the next iteration of the Literature of Sustainability event. Today, we are speaking about and looking at SDG 13, climate action, and we have one of the world's leading scholars on the subject, Professor Jennifer Wenzel of Columbia University. I should also begin with a note of profuse gratitude to Professor Wenzel. I nearly messed up her sabbatical week because we had scheduled her talk for the 23rd. And then I was supposed to intimate to her that we have moved it to 26th, but I never sent that email. So Professor Wenzel had this nasty surprise that when she opens her mail, she finds her date on the flyer as the 26th. But she has been extremely generous and has rescheduled her other things during her sabbatical and this week to be with us. So thank you, and apologies, Professor Wenzel, and to everybody else who might have calculated it to be on the 23rd and got a surprise too. As I said, we have been running this for the past several months, and we are coming to the end of this. And climate fiction is, of course, the trendiest. I don't think I should say the hottest topic around, because it seems quite inappropriate given its global warming and global boiling. But yes, it's the trendiest topic around. And who better to talk about this than Professor Wenzel, who has, I think, we can say very easily and with no equivocation set the grounds for us to study the genre and its associated cognitive areas. So welcome to all of you, and Professor Wenzel, please meet Atul, whom you've also met just before this, who's the assistant to the UNESCO chair, and Professor Anna Kurian, faculty fellow of the UNESCO chair as well. Anna, please meet Professor Jennifer Wenzel of Columbia University. Over to Atul for a more formal introduction. Atul?
Thank you, sir, and welcome, Professor Wenzel. And if I may formally introduce you to the audience, Jennifer Wenzel is a scholar of post-colonial studies and environmental and energy humanities, jointly appointed in the Department of English and Comparative Literature and the Department of Middle Eastern, South Asian, and African Studies at Columbia University. She is an affiliate of the Columbia Climate School and a member of the Petrocultures Research Group and the After Oil Collective. She has held fellowships from Mellon, ACLS, NEH, and Princeton University's Davis Center for Historical Studies. Her first book, Bulletproof: Afterlives of Anti-Colonial Prophecy in South Africa and Beyond, was awarded honorable mention for the Perkins Prize by the International Society for the Study of Narrative. With Imre Zeman and Patricia Yeager, she co-edited Fueling Culture: 101 Words for Energy and Environment. Her recent monograph, The Disposition of Nature, Environmental Crisis and World Literature, was a finalist for the 2020 Book Prize by the Association for the Study of the Arts of the Present, ASAP, and shortlisted for the 2022 Eco-Criticism Book Prize awarded by the Association for the Study of Literature and the Environment. Shorter works have appeared in journals including Aleph, Cultural Critique, Modern Fiction Studies, Novel, A Forum on Fiction, PMLA, Postcolonial Studies, Public Culture, Research in African Literatures, Resilience and Substance. A new collection, titled Power Shift: Keywords for a New Politics of Energy, co-edited with Imre Zeman, is forthcoming in April 2025. Her current book project is titled Beyond the Fossil-Fueled Imagination: How and Why to Read for Energy. Today, her talk is titled Climate Fictions and Narrative Fundamentals. Over to you, Professor Wenzel.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction and for the opportunity to speak with you today, wherever you may be. I was so honored by the invitation from Professor Pramod Nayar to participate in this important lecture series, which I understand as an urgent effort to enlist the imaginative and rhetorical capacities of literature to help realize the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. About 25 years ago, I started work on a similar project to create an anthology of short stories by authors from around the globe, organized around the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. With a colleague, I selected 3 short stories for each of the 30 articles of the UDHR, and both of us taught a course based on these texts. Although we weren't able to publish the anthology, our aim was, I think, quite similar to that of this series, to juxtapose the language and rhetoric of law and policy with that of literature in order to foster thinking between the capacity of each to make things happen in the world. Today, I'm charged with speaking to Sustainable Development Goal 13, climate action. Take urgent action to combat climate change and its impacts by regulating emissions and promoting developments in renewable energy. Of the 5 targets enumerated for Goal 13, the one obviously most relevant to literature is Target 13.3. Take urgent action to combat climate change and its impacts by regulating emissions and promoting developments in renewable energy. Improve education, awareness raising, and human and institutional capacity. In other words, to enlist literature in this work of raising public understanding of climate change and fostering the capacity for climate action. But my talk today will also touch on some of the other enumerated aspects of Target 3, including the differentiated responsibilities of developed and underdeveloped countries and the ways that socioeconomic inequality intersects with climate change. My talk today has 5 sections. I want to begin by acknowledging that the relationship between climate change and literature has received considerable attention in public discourse in 2 contradictory directions. On the one hand, there's an entire recent genre of prose fiction known as cli-fi, or climate fiction, which takes climate change as its subject. The cli-fi mode increasingly appears in film and TV as well. On the other hand, numerous writers and critics, most famously the novelist Amitav Ghosh, have remarked upon a relative lack of fiction about climate change, arguing that writers and readers don't want to write or read about climate change, or that something about climate change itself is too difficult to represent in prose fiction. So consider the contradiction between these 2 phenomena. On the one hand, the increasingly popular genre of cli-fi. On the other, a perceived lack of attention to climate concerns in contemporary literature and culture. As Ghosh argues in The Great Derangement, the lack of literary attention to climate change is an urgent problem, precisely because climate change is, among other things, a crisis of the imagination, and I agree with him about that. In other words, we could say that Ghosh believes that literature has the capacity to be an important mode of action to combat climate change, but that capacity has been dangerously underdeveloped. While I could spend this entire talk responding in detail to Amitav Ghosh's arguments, the first question that I want to consider today is what it means to understand literature as a form of action in the world or upon the planet. What can literature really do? Target 3 of SDG 13 articulates the importance of raising awareness about climate change, an approach that resonates with a common assumption in the humanities, that knowing about a problem is a catalyst for caring, acknowledging, and acting to rectify suffering or injustice. This assumption is also at work in Amitav Ghosh's argument about the need for more climate fiction. But in her book, Living Oil, the American petrocritic Stephanie Lemenager has described this kind of thinking as the relay from media to empathy to action. And like Lemenager, I am skeptical about whether narratives and images work in such straight lines. In other words, I'm skeptical that reading literature necessarily leads to climate action. But to say that media attention or literary representation doesn't work so simply and directly upon the world is not the same thing as saying that literature doesn't do anything at all, quite the contrary. As I argued in The Disposition of Nature, the literary is always already at work in making sense of the environment, even if unpredictably or unhelpfully so. Just as surely as a walk in the woods, nature becomes known to us, in large part through stories that are told or poems that are written about it. In other words, we come to know nature through narratives and other patterns of imagining. Particular literary genres, aesthetic modes, and narrative templates provide the forms through which human understandings of non-human nature are forged. Somewhat paradoxically, these cultural forms, which were made by humans, shape our sense of what is natural or just. In other words, these human constructs naturalize nature. They naturalize nature and its relation to the social. This approach to the efficacy of the literary has important implications for the claims one can make as literature make about literature as doing something in the world. For our purposes today, claims about literature as a form of climate action. Let me name two of these implications. The first has to do with questions of form. The literary texts that we read make their most powerful interventions, not as empirical evidence of environmental crisis, nor as ready-made blueprints for action, but instead through their literary mediations. That is, the ways they transform the world into text, and through the forms of that imagining. The literary does not offer a transparent window on the world. Rather, it frames particular views through artifice and convention, not least the conventions that underwrite realism's sly illusion of offering direct access to reality without mediation. Form has and is content. To grapple with the literary is to recognize that what is said cannot be separated from how it is said. If we want to think about how literature might work upon the world, we have to think first about how a text's formal and rhetorical strategies work upon us as readers. The second implication of this approach is that nature, and therefore climate, is mediated by the literary in a way that precedes and exceeds representation in any particular text. Rather than positing nature or the climate crisis as out there in the world, available to and in need of literary representation, I understand cultural logics to be always already at work in nature or crisis. This distinction is important for several reasons. It troubles the common sense that takes environmental crises like climate change as the problem and literature as the solution, or at least a solution. While such desire for usefulness is compelling as the ground for an ethic of environmental responsibility, such commitment can misrecognize both nature and literature. We want literature to be on the side of the angels or on the side of nature. But there's probably more evidence that literary imagining has been complicit in environmental crisis than that it offers robust solutions. This is particularly true with regard to environmental injustice, as the uneven distribution of benefits and burdens, the good things of nature, as well as their great costs. For me, then, the urgent task is not to look to particularly literary texts for solutions, but instead to understand the role of literature writ large in calculating what counts as nature, what counts as environment, crisis, or even human. This means recognizing the quiet but powerful work that literature and cultural imagining do all the time in naturalizing ideas about nature, as well as about things like progress, the good life, or justice. In other words, what counts and who cares are environmental questions for which literature provides tacit answers that we don't even seek. Amitav Ghosh acknowledges something like this when he observes in The Great Derangement that culture generates desires, by which he means that literature works to foster desires for the good life as imagined through the lens of consumer culture, including cars and appliances in the built environment. Ghosh writes, when we see an advertisement that links a picture of a tropical island to the word paradise, the longings that are kindled in us have a chain of transmission that stretches back to Daniel Defoe and Jean-Jacques Rousseau. But if literature is working all the time to shape ideas about nature and our relationship to it without our really noticing it, then the task of looking for texts that are about climate change, that take up climate change explicitly in their themes and plots, is a rather limited approach to the question of literature and climate action. Perhaps what's needed is instead a kind of unlearning, a coming to know or to unknow what we don't even know we've been taught. This is the necessary process I see described in Maureen McLean's 2016 poem, Okay, Let's Go, from which I've offered you an excerpt. Let's enroll ourselves in the school of the sky, where knowing and how to know and unknow is everything. Knowing how to know and unknow. I'm not exactly sure where the school of the sky meets, But certainly this is the task, the everything before us. In terms of this poem's form, notice how the short lines and short stanzas contrast with the expansiveness and weightiness of that word, everything. And notice the ambiguity of the preposition where. Is it in the school or in the sky that knowing how to know and unknow is everything? How does that difference matter? If literary imagining informs what we talk about when we talk about nature or climate, it also shapes what we don't talk about and the forms those silences take. Perhaps the best example of this cultural silence for our purposes today is what the Canadian petrocritic Imre Zeman has called the fiction of surplus. For Zeman, the fiction of surplus is the assumption that seemingly unlimited access to cheap and easy energy is anything other than an unrepeatable historical accident and anomaly. In other words, the access to plentiful energy from fossil fuels that was enjoyed by many people around the world from the mid-19th century to the mid to late 20th century is the exception rather than the rule across human history. An additional aspect of this fiction of surplus, according to Zeman, is the tacit assumption that this anomalous energy surplus has been inconsequential to modern history rather than a determining factor, its condition of possibility. Zeman writes, the fiction of surplus shapes not only the belief that there will always be plenty of energy to go around, but also the complementary idea that easy access to energy plays at best a secondary role in history by comparison with human intellect and the adventure of progress. Zeman is a literary critic by training, and he makes a final observation about the role of literature in the fiction of surplus. He argues that literature in the era of fossil fuels has been complicit in entrenching this ideological fiction of surplus. He writes, instead of challenging the fiction of surplus, as we might have hoped or expected, literature participates in it just as surely as every other social narrative in the contemporary era. By not reckoning with this historical anomaly of abundant energy, literature has helped to entrench an understanding of fossil-fueled modernity as freedom rather than constraint. This perspective helps us to understand why so many people remain so attached to the world that fossil fuels have made. And it points toward the need to imagine new modes of living in a warming world, how to know and unknow. The multidimensional aspect of Zeman's fiction of surplus, the way he unfolds this idea to join history to ideology and to literature, provides a useful analogy for how I have come to think about climate fictions. As I said at the beginning of this talk, there's a lot of debate about cli-fi, whether to appreciate how much of it there is or to wonder why there isn't enough. But I understand climate fictions in a much broader sense, not merely as a literary genre, a category of recent literary texts about climate change. Instead, I understand climate fictions as human-constructed notions, similar to Zeman's fiction of surplus, but in this case, notions about the Earth's climate, a range of ideas, assumptions, cultural narratives, or hypotheses. And I should note that I'm drawing here on the etymology of the English word fiction, which derives from the Latin verb fingere, to fashion or form. A fiction in this sense is something that is made by humans. So climate fictions in the broadest sense are frameworks constructed by humans for thinking about or not thinking about the climatic conditions of our planetary home. These fictions might include such debatable propositions as humans can't change the climate. There's nothing we can do about climate change. Climate change is something that will happen in the future. Climate change is something that will happen far away to somebody else. Or climate change is only about the weather. The Trump administration has circulated climate fictions of its own, including the idea that climate anxiety is caused by climate science rather than by climate change, and that the way to avoid climate anxiety is to defund climate science. Climate fictions also include scenarios and projections of a near future climate change world, whether those offered by scientists, writers, or by ordinary people as they contemplate the possible trajectories of their lives and the lives of their descendants. This multidimensional approach to climate fiction opens up some important questions that are certainly relevant to SDG 13. If we think among these different versions of climate fictions, both literary and non-literary, then we might better understand the role of literature and the literary imagination in fashioning, interpreting, and inhabiting them. What work does the imagination do in the world, in grappling both with the worlds that humans have made and with the boundary parameters of the Earth system that has shaped life on this planet as we have known it? How do cultural and narrative assumptions shape the work of scientists and policymakers? How can prose fiction help readers to engage with the challenges of knowledge, emotion, anticipation, judgment, and action that a warming world will require? How can climate fictions of all sorts help readers and citizens to try on modes of living and other futures that we do or do not want? Or more dangerously, how can climate fictions lull us into thinking that such anticipation is unnecessary or futile? This idea of fiction as a way to try on modes of living comes from Catherine Gallagher, an American critic of Victorian literature. Gallagher traces the rise of what she calls fictionality in 18th century Great Britain, a moment when the word fiction starts to refer to a literary narrative as opposed to a deception or a lie. In other words, the shift to describing literary narratives as fictions meant that they were being newly understood as a form of truth rather than a form of lying. Believable stories that did not solicit belief. The value of fictionality, according to Gallagher, is that it allows readers to practice a kind of cognitive provisionality, to be able to imagine what it would be like to be someone else. For us today, fictionality offers a kind of imaginative immersion, trying on different possible futures or alternative presents, some of which we might find in sci-fi, some of which we might find in other unexpected places. So far, I've talked about the complex ways that literature works upon readers to shape ideas about nature and the world, and the value of fictionality as a way of trying on other ways of being. But what about the challenges that climate change poses to literature itself? As Naomi Klein and others have observed, climate change is the kind of change that changes everything. How then is climate change changing literature or narrative? Journalist David Roberts offers a provocative answer to this question. He observes that global warming affects everything that rests on that substrate of modern civilization: agriculture, land use, transportation, energy, politics, behavior, everything. Climate change is not a story, but a background condition for all future stories. In other words, climate has always served as a kind of foundation for narrative. But I want to take that idea of background condition or foundation a bit further to think about the fundamental building blocks of narrative, what narrative is made of. Think back to your earliest literary education, maybe in primary school, where you may have learned about the three basic elements of a story. What do you need for a story? Every story has a plot, characters, and setting, right? But if climate change is the background condition for all future stories, then it seems to me that the relationship among these elements has started to change. We generally understand plot as the stuff that happens in a story, a series of events premised on cause and effect. Characters are the agents who do that stuff or to whom that stuff happens. And setting, generally defined as a narrative's time and place, is understood to be the stable backdrop, the background condition in which those dynamic events of the plot take place. But what pressures does climate change put on this notion of setting as a stable backdrop for plot when lands are engulfed by rising seas or raging floods? In narrative terms, the seeming stability of setting gives way to a series of climate events: drought, fire, flood, with terrifying capacity to shape the lives of humans and non-humans alike. In terms of temporality, the time when a narrative is set is now powerfully shadowed in a material, molecular sense by the combustion over the past 2 centuries of fuels that fossilized millions of years ago. So what happens to narrative when setting becomes character, plot becomes setting, objects become subjects, and part becomes whole? when agency, that is, the capacity to be a protagonist or a character, is distributed across human and non-human entities, when the relationship between cause and effect, which is the foundation of plot, is dilated across vast spans of space and time, that is, the dimensions of setting. I'm not sure that we have even begun to think through these questions. But they do bring to mind a provocation by the Scottish petrocritic Graham MacDonald, who envisions a form of what he calls bookshop activism. This practice would entail going into a bookstore and taking the sign from the current events section of the store and switching that sign out with the sign that says speculative fiction. In other words, novels in a speculative vein by Margaret Atwood or N.K. Jemisin, Nnedi Okorafor, or Vandana Singh would be categorized as current events, as matter-of-fact reportage of the now, while on the other hand, most bourgeois conventional fiction and mainstream nonfiction that doesn't register the weird transformations afoot in this world and on this planet, all of that kind of writing would be categorized as speculative fiction, as wild, counterfactual, imaginative, unreal yarns. This category switch has arguably already begun to happen with novels like Octavia Butler's Parable of the Sower. MacDonald's bookshop activism thought experiment, I want to argue, is underwritten by two literary insights. First, the narrative strategies that have gone by the name of literary realism are under profound pressure amidst the myriad changes to the Earth system named by the Anthropocene. The conventions of literary realism are contingent upon assumptions about what the real is and how it works. Those assumptions about the real are being overwhelmed by new and newly recognized facts on the ground in a world that isn't quite what we thought, when nature and the planet are behaving in unfamiliar ways. The second literary insight is that MacDonald's idea of bookshop activism offers a powerful rejoinder to Amitav Ghosh's desire for more novels about climate change. Instead, MacDonald's thought experiment allows us to consider a more provocative possibility, that all contemporary fiction can be read as climate change fiction. The question is, in what mode, if at all, climate change registers on the page? Let me develop some of these arguments by turning to a literary example, a novel that tries to imagine past the end of the fossil economy, thereby allowing readers to try on one possible future. Paolo Bacigalupi's young adult novel Shipbreaker, published in 2010, is a speculative fiction that imagines the Gulf Coast of the United States in a climate-changed post-petroleum future. The novel takes place in a region called the Orleans, which readers slowly come to understand is a series of cities built after the original New Orleans was swallowed by the sea. These new cities are drowned one after the next as sea level rise accelerates. Here, the stability of narrative setting has given way to plot in a series of disastrous events that have literally submerged the ground upon which the story takes place. The shipbreakers of the novel's title are a group of adolescents who work in a makeshift coastal salvage yard, stripping beached oil tankers of copper and other valuable parts. The narrator describes the scene. All around, the ocean was a glittering mirror. Breakers rolled up to the shore, white as a baby's teeth. The black hulks of the broken ships stood out in the sun, looming monuments to a world that had fallen apart. If this scenario and this image of oil tankers as monuments to a bygone world seem familiar to you, it's because Bacigalupi borrows them from a series of photographs by Edward Burtynsky, which documented the shipbreaking industry in Chittagong, Bangladesh. Bacigalupi's speculative future projection from 2010 about what's to come after our present turns out to be a textual approximation of photographs that Burtynsky took in the early 2000s. Bacigalupi explained in a 2011 interview that his books aren't dystopias, but instead accidental futures, the kind you get when there's a lack of forethought, a surfeit of poor planning, or just plain cynicism. He continued, frankly, most of the worst details of the worlds I describe are based heavily on our present. Chittagong, Bangladesh isn't a dystopia, it's just a really poor place where we dump our scrap ships because they have fewer worker safety and environmental controls. In a 2012 interview, Bacigalupi further explained that he'd long been aware of the shipbreaking industry in Bangladesh, but Pertinsky's photos were so haunting that they buried into my head like a little worm, he said. Set in an accidental future, Bacigalupi's novel offers a cautionary tale. The people who inhabited the period the novel calls the accelerated age, that is, our present, were too stupid, inert, or cynical to avoid climate change. The historical exposition that one character offers to the novel's uneducated and underinformed protagonist is also implicitly addressed to the novel's reader as a defamiliarizing invitation, not only to try on a possible future, but also to re-see the unthinking excess of our own oil-driven present, to learn how to know and unknow. But what are the stakes and the perils of borrowing photographic images of petro-waste work and exposure to oily toxic risk that is already happening in the global south in order to imagine what may lie ahead for the US Gulf Coast? In other words, how can we understand the relationship between intellectual debt and climate debt across vast planetary divides of wealth, power, and responsibility? And I should say that my students sometimes have difficulty locating the geographic setting of this novel, partly because its depiction of child labor seems to point toward what they call a third world, global south, or non-US setting, which is, among other things, an invitation for me to explain the meaning of third world. How do we think between the fact that Bacigalupi borrows the present misery of Bangladesh shipbreakers for the setting of his accidental American future, on the one hand, and the fact that climate change itself can be understood as the industrialized world or global north having borrowed against, even stolen, the future of the underdeveloped world and having expropriated and used up the planet's capacity to metabolize greenhouse gases on the other? This is the question of climate justice in a nutshell, which is concerned with the staggering inverse relations between causes and effects, between responsibility and harm. At this point, it's almost common knowledge that the communities that have historically contributed least to the causes of climate change are projected to disproportionately suffer its effects with the least capacity to adapt and endure. An important historical argument that Amitav Ghosh makes in The Great Derangement is that modern Europe's military and economic dominance was made possible not only through the combustion of fossil fuels. More importantly, this dominance required the active suppression of a carbon economy in the colonial periphery. Ghosh writes, the emerging fossil fuel economies of the West required that people elsewhere be prevented from developing coal-based energy systems of their own by compulsion if necessary. Poor people are not poor because they were indolent or unwilling. Their poverty is itself an effect of the inequities created by the carbon economy, systems set up by brute force. Ghosh uses the word poverty in a broad sense here, but we can also read it as energy poverty or unequal and inadequate access to energy. This history of energy and climate injustice, Ghosh suggests, is the result of a plan. This frank insistence on European colonial violence and its enduring economic and environmental effects in particular sites in the global south is salutary at a moment when the present and future challenge of climate change offers one more occasion to forget or disavow colonialism and its historical engines of inequality that continue to shape the present. Because in Ghosh's account, the task of climate justice would require a global redistribution of wealth and power, he concludes that global inaction on climate change is by no means the result of confusion or denialism. To the contrary, the maintenance of the status quo is the plan. In this sense, Ghosh's analysis is compatible with Bacigalupi's, as we read at the end of his novel, the wealthy measure everything with the weight of their money. When the rich people in the novel, known as swanks, weighed the environmental costs of oil against the money they could make, they decided to keep drilling until the cities just drowned too many times and oil was finally outlawed. This is the scandal euphemized in the notion of common but differentiated responsibility that underwrites multilateral agreements on climate and environmental law. In terms of SDG 13, these questions of climate justice are tacitly acknowledged in targets 13A and 13B, which focus on the plight of developing countries and marginalized communities. But what's particularly confounding about climate change is that these dynamics operate over vast scales of time and space and are also multi-scalar, joining the local with the planetary, and the now with the long ago, and with futures, both distant and ever more proximate. Climate change is an intergenerational problem that links human activity over the past 2 centuries with effects on the atmosphere and oceans for thousands of years into the future. Its ambit is vastly diachronic, often phrased in terms of the world that we're leaving to our children. Yet the politics of Bacigalupi, borrowing the present of immiserated communities in the global south to imagine the future of the global north, are rather more pointed than any simple assertion that children are the future. I've written elsewhere about how looming environmental crises in the 21st century have reversed colonial-era progress narratives with their promises of civilization and development, in which Europe and the West were said to offer the rest of the world an image of its own future. In a colonial context, this dynamic of positing some people's presence as other people's futures led the anthropologist Johannes Fabian to theorize what he called the denial of coevalness, by which he meant the refusal to acknowledge that others inhabit the same world, the same moment in time. Fabian identified this tendency as fundamental to European ethnocentrism. European perceptions of people as backward, behind, or beneath were invoked to justify colonial conquest and so-called civilizing projects. The reversal of this dynamic and recent discourse on climate change and environmental crisis, which finds third world harbingers of first world futures, appears across the political spectrum, from the neoconservative fever dreams of Robert Kaplan to Jean and John Komaroff's theory from the South, to Amitav Ghosh's description of climate change as a reversal of the temporal order of modernity. Those at the margins are the first to experience the future that awaits all of us. In these spatiotemporal transpositions, the consequences of carbon accumulation in the future are imagined to look a lot like being on the wrong end of capital accumulation in the present. The crucial question in making sense of such intergenerational transnational imaginings, I would argue, is whether they acknowledge the shared but uneven history that joins these past, presents, and futures. These links are implicit in Bacigalupi's novel Shipbreaker if readers are able to contemplate the various kinds of debt, intellectual and ecological, that join places like Bangladesh to the accidental future of the US Gulf Coast. The emphasis on class stratification in Bacigalupi's depiction of a world after petromodernity invites us to consider the relationship between 2 related crises of futurity: the future lost to climate change as the belated cost of modernity's chain of ease, as opposed to the predicament of never having enjoyed the benefits of modernity to begin with. A fundamental assumption in the energy humanities is that energy transitions do not merely involve the substitution of one fuel source for another, but instead the transformation of myriad relations: political, economic, infrastructural, environmental, social, cultural, and affective, that constellate around particular energy regimes. Understood in this way, energy is bound up with values and ethics, as well as subjectivity, desire, and embodied experience. How are ideas of what it means to be human, or notions of the good life, or democratic politics, tacitly premised on access to cheap, reliable energy, on Siemens' fiction of surplus? In other words, how does energy underwrite what we understand as justice? As Dipesh Chakraborty has famously written, the mansion of modern freedoms stands upon an ever-expanding base of fossil fuel use. But what about a world where that base is shrinking? Bacigalupi's novel Shipbreaker suggests that an energy transition undertaken without an emphasis on climate and energy justice will only entrench existing inequalities and create new ones, downsizing that mansion of freedoms or further walling it off from most of the world's inhabitants. I have read Bacigalupi's Shipbreaker as a novel of energy transition, one that warns of some of the pitfalls in SDG 13's imperative to promote developments in renewable energy. I want to turn now to another prose fiction, an example of what I've come to think of as a genre of running out of gas narratives. The Petrol Pump is a short story by Italo Calvino, published in 1974 and written amidst the oil shock of the early 1970s, when the price of oil quadrupled almost overnight in the wake of an OPEC embargo against the US and European allies. The Petrol Pump is a story about filling up a car's fuel tank, or at least trying to when all the stations are closed or out of petrol. But the first-person narrator's restless imagination, his associative way of seeing the world, means that the story is about much more than pumping gas. If we think back to Maureen McLean's poem, Okay, Let's Go, we might say that it's about everything. Like other running out of gas narratives, the Petrol Pump draws connections between a car running out of gas and the world running out of oil, an imaginative possibility that looks a lot like the end of the world in the story. There's so much to say about this story, but the line that grabs me every time is the one from the protagonist narrator. For a while, I've been getting used to imagining the future without flinching. Running on empty, then finally filling his tank with gasoline, the narrator imagines backward in time to the prehistoric fossilization of ancient creatures into modern fuels, and forward in time to an apocalyptic moment of the ultimate cataclysm, the simultaneous drying up, perhaps, of oil wells, pipelines, tanks, pumps, carburetors, oil sumps, resulting in rows of abandoned, cobweb-draped cars, as if all engines everywhere had ceased their firing and the wheeling life of the human race had stopped. And of course, this is what I think about every time I pump gas. Whereas Calvino's narrator associates the end of oil with the end of the world, we who inhabit the energy and environmental crises of the 21st century are tasked with facing a formidable future in which it is not scarcity, but instead the ongoing surplus of fossil fuels that threatens the world and the earth as we have known them. As with the world confronted by Calvino's narrator, for us too, the time when everything seemed easy is over. How can we learn to face the future without flinching? The first answer might be found in the narrator's wild speculation at the end of Calvino's story, when his tank is full and the pump clicks off. The day the Earth's crust reabsorbs the cities, this plankton sediment that was humankind will be covered by geological layers of asphalt and cement until in millions of years' time it thickens into oily deposits on whose behalf we do not know. Something remarkable happens here as the narrator imagines into a far future when humans and all of their stuff will fossilized into oil for some as yet unknown someone else. This vision tells us that there is a future for humans and also for oil. Reincorporating human technology and civilization into the cyclic metabolism of the Earth system, this imagined future challenges the commonplace idea that the end of oil is the end of the world. Yet for us in the 21st century, it's the persistence of petromodernity rather than its end that feels apocalyptic. Calvino's story was written before the emergence of broad public awareness of climate change. However, I want to suggest that the fact that the story poses the question of facing the future without flinching means that we can read it with an eye toward learning how to know and unknow in the face of climate change. This approach to literary texts that are ostensibly not about climate change is compatible with another idea from Graham MacDonald about how pre-20th century texts might be read for glimpses of what a post-oil future might look like. What will a non-hydrocarbon imaginary look like after the reign of oil? MacDonald asks. He suggests that perhaps literary texts that predate the era of oil can be re-energized for the glimpses of worlds outside the carbon web, fueled by other energy sources. Emma Woodhouse gazes admiringly at the abundance of timber and roads and avenues on the estate of her future husband in Jane Austen's Emma. Can such pre-oil energy memories be useful for a post-oil world? Did people really walk 60 miles each way on errands and business, as Mr. Earnshaw does matter-of-factly in Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights? MacDonald argues for the value of reading these scenes of life before oil while contemplating a life after oil, and temporal mode of sense-making that creates what he calls chronological backflips, with refueled scenes from literary history opening a window on a possible energy imaginary. For my part, I understand this interpretive practice as part of a broader project of rereading that climate change and the imperative of energy transition demand. In other words, instead of merely lamenting a lack of texts about oil or climate change, as Amitav Ghosh has been doing for more than 30 years, this interpretive posture would return to old and familiar texts with new eyes to see what they have to say about our current predicaments, if we care to look. In order to bring this talk to a close, I want to acknowledge the stark contrast between the hopeful pledges to the future and the Sustainable Development Goals articulated in 2015 and the perilous state of the world and the planet in 2025, something I feel keenly as a US citizen committed to decarbonization and democracy. The Trump administration, as I've said, is one of the most powerful authors of climate fictions today, just as oil companies have long been one of the most important forces in shaping the fossil-fueled imagination. As he wages his war on wind power, Trump is a modern-day Don Quixote, tilting at windmills that he mistakes for ugly monsters. Making good on a campaign pledge to US oil companies, he is working to roll back energy transition and climate change mitigation efforts across the globe by tying tariff deals to the purchase of US fossil fuels. In the realm of public discourse, concerns about climate change have been rebranded as weird science or woke, part of a broader effort to make problems disappear by banishing their vocabulary. Stop saying climate and maybe climate change goes away. Stop saying race, gender, inequality, and maybe the conditions themselves are no longer real. It's a politics of erasure, and yet the material crises don't vanish, a politics of looking away. Yet even when ruthlessly defunded and disavowed, these issues remain: melting ice caps, rising seas, environmental injustice, structural violence. As an alternative to such unsustainable development goals, I think back to Graham MacDonald's idea of chronological backflips, how we can find guidance for facing the future from the literature of the past, if we care to look. I want to conclude with Stephanie Lemenager's capacious definition of cli-fi, a mode of imagining that she finds not only in prose fiction about climate change, but in many other media. In a YouTube video called What is Cli-Fi?, Lemenager identifies what the cli-fi impulse is fundamentally about. She says, "It's about loving the world and about not being afraid to continue to love the world, even in a moment of mass extinction. And it's also about salvaging ourselves as a species, remaking ourselves in a way that I hope means a more sound, sustainable, just future." These words have stuck with me since I first heard them. This is the only way I know how to face the future without flinching. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Professor Wenzel, for the terrific talk. We'll now have questions and comments from the audience.
Thank you, Professor
Great.
Wenzel. There were several points of interest, and the point about narratives and energy sources, it brought to my mind a present crisis in India, where a village called Salal in Kashmir is being exploited for lithium that is believed to exist in large quantities. So the lithium mining heavily pollutes the water and the soil. So there are two narratives that exist against this process. And one of them is that the local residents are affected, their agriculture, their biodiversity. There are around 330 families. They face potential displacement. They are arguably part of the land itself. They have been there for generations. However, the narrative that seems to get more traction is that this whole lithium mining process itself is redundant because the sodium ion battery is fast developing. Some variants of it are already in use, I believe, as we speak, and soon lithium will be replaced because sodium is more abundant. And this is the narrative that seems to be getting more attention, because it's a matter of how stupid the powers that be are rather than how cruel. So if it, because it's actually it's more than whether it's sodium or lithium, because the fact that there potential fuel exists is it's reason enough to displace families, to let's say cause environmental crisis, to kill off the biodiversity of a region, and the only valid point against it is that the fuel itself is redundant. So which narratives get more attention? I think that's also a point of interest. That's what I wanted to say as a response.
Thank you so much for that contribution. I think, and I really like the way that you've rolled it out as two narratives rather than one. And certainly, this is a question that, or you've given voice to something that has occurred to me before in other contexts. Are they stupid or are they cruel, right? And so I guess what I would say is that I'm not sure. I'm not going to answer the question of whether they're stupid or they're cruel, but I like the way that you've kind of articulated this in terms of present harm and future possibilities, to how to think about the time horizons of technological developments that would make lithium obsolete. And I suppose the broader point that I would draw out a bit, I think is compatible with my discussion of the novel Shipbreaker, which is that a transition away from fossil fuels, I think, is easy for some to imagine as a utopia, but of course, externalities remain in any energy regime, and the substitution of the fuel itself will not eliminate the kinds of harm at sites of extraction, whether the extraction of oil or the extraction of lithium. So I guess I'm saying that I see a kind of parallel in what you're saying with the kind of two kinds of harm that we can associate with fossil fuels, or at least two. One is precisely the harms upon communities near sites of extraction, which are connected to, but not at all the same as the harms of climate change, and how to think between these kinds of harm. So I'm not sure if that's a satisfying answer to your provocation, but I would say again that I really value the complexity of it in terms of recognizing multiple ways of thinking about a situation. And one can hope that sodium ion batteries come online and are scalable very soon. I also wonder, and I certainly know about lithium as an issue. It's something that always comes up when we talk about renewables. I am not actually familiar yet with what kind of externalities may be, or forms of harm may be associated with sodium ion. Yeah, but thank you again for your question.
Thank you, Professor Wenzel.
Shayantan, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Professor. It was a very enriching lecture for all of us. I was very interested about how you talked about the climate change being the narrative background for all future stories. I was almost reminded of Cousin Steve's adaptation of King Lear, where he brings King Lear to the patients and how the poverty and hunger and all displacements are going on in the quote unquote background of the whole narrative of Lear. So I was trying to think about, or rather ask you about the idea of temporality in the imagining or reimagining sci-fi, as you were rightly pointing out about this project of rereading past stories about to grapple a sense of the future and the time to come. So, if you could point on the idea of temporality and climate fictions.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. And I wish I knew King Lear better than I do. It's been decades since I've read Lear, maybe a few years since I've seen a production, but I really like your kind of example of a scene from that play, which feels like we can think of it by way of analogy in terms of imagining climate futures to come. For my own parts, maybe ill-advised for me to mention a novel that I suspect few on this call have read, but I'll just go ahead and say it anyway. That I in teaching a course on the novel of Africa, the novel in Africa, forgive me. I spent a long time thinking about Thomas Mafolo's novel Shaka, which was published in the early 20th century, and it's a novel about an early 19th century Zulu king emperor who, let's say, it's a kind of tragic arc, his rise and very violent fall, and there's a moment in that novel where toward the end of the novel where Shaka is shown the effects of his actions, and it's the depiction of basically a kind of uninhabitable landscape devoid of humans. And there's something about that scene in terms of the way it describes the human, the category of the human and the future itself, that obviously Mafolo is not thinking at all about climate change, but there's something in the vividness, the viscerality of that scene that helps me think about helps me think about climate change. And I would say, maybe again by way of analogy, that Mafolo, in writing his novel in the early 20th century about a figure from the early 19th century, is doing exactly that work of chronological backflips that Graham MacDonald describes, in terms of looking to a history of the past to think about the challenges that face his country in the present, which is under threat of becoming incorporated into a newly independent South Africa. So that's one way of thinking about temporality, in terms of how readers and writers can move back and forth in time to imagine ourselves into different futures. But you may have been asking about another part of my argument, where I'm thinking about the temporality of climate change itself. And I'm not the first person to write about this, although I've been writing about it for a long time. But I also think of someone like Andreas Malm. I think even Amitov Ghosh is thinking about the phenomenon of climate change as it unrolls upon the planet, the atmosphere, and oceans, as bringing together different moments in time in terms of molecules in the atmosphere and the oceans that were combusted, not today, not yesterday, but possibly 200 years ago. And so how do we think about that past and the way that it's working as an agent in our present, and will continue to work as an agent long into the future? So I'm ambivalent about that. I'm ambivalent about thinking about that temporality, let's put it that way, because I've spent much of my career thinking about complicated temporal relations. And so there is a certain kind of excitement for me in thinking about that temporal complexity. but I'm ambivalent because it's also because the temporality is so complex. It's a problem that is difficult to address in the world and will exert or will create all kinds of suffering in the future, even if we all decided, as in Calvino's story, to stop all the fossil fueled engines today. That temporality persists. Thank you so much, Shanatan, for your question.
Thank you, Professor Wenzel.
Amrita has a question. Please go ahead.
Hi, ma'am. Thank you for this enriching session. As you talk about climate change, we can nowadays see flood, landslides, wildfire, etc. also as a theme or a background of novels, short stories, poems, etc. So, do you think disaster, or if we call it as a subsection or a subgenre, or do you think is it part of this climate fiction, or can we consider it as an evolving subgenre?
Yeah, I'm not exactly sure that I would draw kind of permanent lines between kind of disaster fiction and cli-fi. I guess what I would say, and actually, as you were beginning to talk, I anticipated or I expected that you would be talking about wildfire, floods, etc., as aspects of disaster in our everyday reality, right? But of course, they're also making their way into fiction and have been for a while. I guess what I would say in terms of saying, well, this part is disaster and this part is cli-fi, is that to be sure, you know, as those events are happening with increasing frequency and increasing intensity, it's only to be expected that more people will write about them. But I think I would worry, I suppose, about cli-fi as a literary genre being equated with or taken over by disaster writing, right? Because disaster itself is a kind of narrative template that creates certain kinds of expectations. It creates certain kinds of plots. It has place for certain kinds of characters. And I remain interested in, you know, maybe if I'll finish my sentence and then I'll qualify it. I remain interested in the possibility of a way of imagining climate change that acknowledges the difficulties and the harms and the disasters, but finds ways to engage with the changes that are happening in a mode that isn't only apocalyptic, if that makes sense, right? So I wouldn't want cli-fi and disaster or cli-fi and apocalypse to become only the same thing. Now, of course, the qualification that I wanted to add is that, you know, I've been writing and talking about climate change for some time now. And you know, as the parts per million clock has continued to tick, or that number has continued to rise, and as pledges for climate action made about a decade ago are, you know, not exactly being fulfilled. When I first started talking about humanities thinking and climate change, I talked about the value of the literary or humanities thinking as slowing down to ask questions, not rushing to solutions. And I feel in the present a kind of urgency, right, that we could really use some solutions. And so I don't want to dismiss action in a way. I don't want to dismiss urgent action in a way that I might have 10 years ago. So that's a way of saying, to complete my analogy, that, you know, if I look back on the recording of our conversation 20 years from now, I hope that I feel the same, but I worry that disaster will have become even more a part of our background condition, which should, I suppose, spur us all to more thoughtful climate action today. I hope that answered your question.
Thank you.
Sumana has a question. Please go ahead.
Am I audible?
Yes.
Hello. Okay.
Hi.
So, ma'am, first of all, hi, ma'am. So, thank you for this wonderful lecture, ma'am. I just wanted to ask you. So, when you mentioned that in the future, about fiction and plot, character, and setting. So, in the near or far future, the fiction will have the climate change as the setting, or rather, the changed climate or changed environment as the setting. So, will that emerge as the new normal? And if it does, then will it not will it not reduce the concern of climate fiction as we see today? Because if the changed environment becomes normal, then it wouldn't look as very dangerous.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you, Simona, for this question. And you're getting into the territory of a set of questions that I want to write about, but haven't necessarily written about yet. But as you're talking, your ideas reminded me of another novel that I teach, which is Abdulrahman Munif's novel Cities of Salt, which is a fictionalization of the arrival of an American oil company in what is recognizably Saudi Arabia in the 1930s. And one of the things that emerges in that novel, where Bedouin and Arab characters come into contact with Americans for the first time, and the infrastructure of oil extraction is built in what had been a series of oases, as well as on the coast. There's a powerful experience that some of the characters start to have, where they had had a particular relationship to time, which involved variability, the cycle of the seasons, some seasons drier than others. But the arrival of the oil industry creates a new relationship to time, where, I forget if this is what a character says or what I say about it, where the only thing certain is change, right? So the only thing that they can rely on is that things will change. And I'm not enough of a climate scientist to be able, or I'm not one at all, right? To be able to tell you whether this ongoing transformation and this ongoing or the kind of rapid transformation of places around the globe will kind of settle into a new normal that can take the place of setting as we've come to understand it, or whether the only thing certain is change. Right? Whether the only thing that one can expect as a background condition is that one does not know what to expect. And so I'm grateful for the question, which I can't answer with any certainty, but it certainly adds some more detail to my provocation about how narrative, I think, has assumed a kind of stability of parameters, just as human life has assumed a kind of stability of parameters, and what that will mean in the future. So Mona, I hope that answered your question, and again, it's
Yes, ma'am.
something
Thank
that
you.
I find really interesting.
Thanks a lot. With that, we'll bring this session to its conclusion. And for a more formal vote of thanks, may I invite Roy, who has been one of our most loyal participants over the years, to deliver a brief vote of thanks. Roy, go ahead, please.
Thank you, Atul. It was indeed an honor to listen to Professor Jennifer Wenzel, who is one of the pioneering and leading scholars in CRI-FI. So thank you, Professor Wenzel, for sparing your valuable time for us. I suppose it should be around 10 in the morning in New York. Thank you to Professor Pramod K. Nayar, the UNESCO Chair in Vulnerability Studies, and Professor Anna Kurian, Faculty Fellow to the UNESCO Chair, for organizing the meeting. Thank you to Atul, an indispensable part of the chair, and Mabel Susan for designing the attractive poster for today's event. And thanks to all the participants and attendees.
Thank you all. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.